Your phone starts vibrating before dawn. Not once, again. Again. The screen lights up your nightstand in a cold blue rectangle. And before your feet hit the floor, one message cuts through the rest. Mr. Secretary, tankers are stopping. You are Scott Bessent, Treasury Secretary, and US markets open in a few hours. That's the clock. You can already hear the low hum of the office before you get there. HVAC, speakerphone static, coffee turning bitter on a conference table, the soft slap of briefing folders. By the time you walk into Treasury, screens glow, a map of the Gulf is pinned up, and someone says too carefully, "We may be looking at a prolonged disruption in Hormuz." Prolonged. That word is worse than spike, worse than surge. Spikes fade. Prolonged gets into expectations. An aide slides a page toward you. Ships are hesitating, insurers are repricing, crude's up, yields are moving. How much? Enough that if this holds into the open, it won't stay in energy. You don't need the full briefing yet. You know the chain: missiles, tankers, oil, shipping, prices, voters. A narrow strip of water half a world away, and somehow it ends up on a glowing gas station sign in Ohio. That is the part people miss. The second explosion, not the one on television, the one in markets. A year earlier, this all looked cleaner. You were sworn in as the 79th Treasury Secretary on January the 28th, 2025. You came in with a doctrine. On March 6th, 2025, at the Economic Club of New York, you laid it out plainly. Iran's economy was already under strain. 35% official inflation, a currency down 60% in the previous 12 months. Its oil exports were running around 1.5 to 1.6 million barrels a day. The goal was to drive that flow to a trickle, not manage it, not trim it, choke it. Then on April 2nd, 2025, at Treasury's FinCEN Iran Maximum Pressure and Counter-Terrorism Exchange, you said the line that now hangs over this entire morning. Economic security and national security go hand in hand. At the time, it sounded like doctrine. Now, under fluorescent lights, with 3 phones buzzing on the table, it sounds like a warning. Because by 2025, Treasury is not just freezing bank accounts. You are deep inside the hidden machinery of oil, ships, front companies. Cargo blending, false paperwork, ship-to-ship transfers, shell ownership, the shadow fleet that keeps sanctioned barrels moving when they aren't supposed to move. On July 3rd, 2025, Treasury sanctions networks that had collectively transported and purchased billions of dollars worth of Iranian oil, including cargo disguised as Iraqi oil. Wait, what? Yes, disguised, blended, relabeled. A barrel can cross an ocean with a fake identity. Then July 30th. Treasury announces its largest Iran-related action since 2018, more than 50 individuals and entities targeted, more than 50 vessels identified, tied to the network controlled by Mohammed Hossein Shamkhani. Treasury says the network generated tens of billions of dollars in profit moving oil and cargo from Iran and Russia. So when the crisis comes, you are not learning this market from a briefing memo. You helped squeeze its arteries. And then the region catches fire. The Strait of Hormuz is not just another shipping lane. In 2023, according to the U.S. Energy Information Administration, about 20.9 million barrels a day of crude, condensate, and petroleum products moved through it. More than 1/4 of the world's seaborne oil trade, roughly 20% of global petroleum liquids consumption, and around 1/5 of global LNG trade too, about 10.4 billion cubic feet per day. A fifth of LNG, more than 1/4 of seaborne oil, through one chokepoint. On the wall map, it looks absurdly small, a pinch in the system, a narrow valve in the global economy, and there are only limited ways around it. Saudi Arabia and the UAE have some bypass pipeline capacity, but nowhere near enough to replace the strait in a real disruption. Which means the question is not whether the United States imports every one of those barrels directly. It doesn't matter, oil is globally priced. If buyers in Asia and Europe start scrambling for replacement cargoes, they bid up barrels everywhere. America does not get a private discount because the crisis is far away. Then the line comes in from the Associated Press. Attacks on commercial ships and threats of further strikes have stopped nearly all tankers from carrying oil, gas, and other goods through the passage. Nearly all. The room goes quiet in that particular Washington way where nobody says panic out loud because saying it might make it real. A voice on speaker asks, "What are we seeing in yields? Up. How fast? Fast enough? Short, flat, bad." You glance at the clock. Markets open in a few hours. That deadline matters because once ships hesitate, everything else starts moving in the wrong direction. Insurers jack up risk, cargoes sit offshore, refiners scramble, freight planners reroute. Traders stop asking how bad today is and start asking the question that actually matters. How long? That is the real enemy. Duration, a spike is survivable, a disruption with no visible end date is different. That gets into contracts, hedges, borrowing costs, headlines, campaign talking points, household habits. It turns one bad week into a story people tell themselves about the future. And futures are already trying to tell that story before the opening bell, so publicly you do what a Treasury Secretary has to do. You calm, you flatten your voice. You do not feed the fire. Reported coverage from early March 2026 summarizes the message in a phrase almost designed to keep traders from stampeding. The oil market is well supplied. That sentence is not really about supply, it is about psychology. If traders think Washington has options, the move can stall. If they think Washington is improvising, they will price fear first and facts later. But the contradiction is already sitting in front of you. You spent 2025 arguing Iran's oil revenues should be crushed. Now, as Hormuz seizes up, reported emergency ideas include tanker escorts, US insurance support, temporary sanctions flexibility, even discussion of allowing certain Iranian oil already at sea to move to keep prices from spiraling. Axios also reported temporary relief tied to some Russian oil cargoes stranded at sea. Wait, what? Yes. The man pushing maximum pressure is now staring at options that could mean more oil from sanctioned channels. To critics, that sounds like hypocrisy. From your chair, with stale coffee in the air and a legal pad filling with arrows and contingencies, it looks like triage. In peacetime, pressure the adversary. In a shock, protect the household. Hormuz forces those two goals into the same morning. Another aide leans in. If escorts are possible, they won't be immediate. You nod once. That's the whole problem. Every tool has a lag. Markets don't. Sanctions take time. Escorts take time. Waivers take time. Statements buy minutes, maybe hours, if people believe them. But gasoline doesn't wait for a policy memo. That is why you are not just watching crude. You are watching the Treasury market. AP reports yields jumping on fears that war with Iran could keep oil and natural gas prices elevated and drive inflation higher. And once yields rise, the problem escapes the energy lane. Borrowing costs rise. Financial conditions tighten. Growth fears creep in. The shock starts looking less like a fuel problem and more like a whole economy problem. This is the part almost nobody sees. The public sees maps, missiles, warships, statements. You are watching bond screens before dawn, because if yields lurch higher, a naval crisis is already bleeding into mortgages, loans, business investment, and confidence. Treasury's own Borrowing Advisory Committee says high energy prices can feed inflation in other goods and services, explicitly naming food and airfares. Of course they can. Diesel hits freight, jet fuel hits tickets, farm fuel and fertilizer seep into groceries. Shipping disruptions add cost before products even reach a shelf. But the first number people feel is still the simplest one. Gasoline. That bright roadside number does more political damage than a chart full of tanker rates ever will. People do not need to know Hormuz carried 20.9 million barrels a day in 2023. They do not need to know what cargo blending is. They do not need to know the name Mohammed Hossein Shamkhani. They know when it costs more to drive to work. They know when a weekend trip gets cancelled. They know when filling the tank feels like a small act of surrender. And then comes the most dangerous thought in an inflation-sensitive economy. Here we go again. That thought matters because inflation is not only what people pay. It is what they start expecting. A strike happens. A captain delays transit. An insurer rewrites a premium. A trader lifts a bid. A futures contract jumps. A refinery pays more. A gas station updates the sign with that hard mechanical click. A commuter sees it on the way to work and decides the economy is getting worse. That is the transmission mechanism. That is what lands on your desk. Not just Iran, not just tankers, not just oil. Belief turning into behavior. And the job has an asymmetry that makes it almost cruel. If you succeed, most people will never know why the crisis didn't get worse. No one throws a parade because inflation expectations stayed contained. No one applauds because the spike stopped at the terminal gate instead of reaching the checkout line. If you fail, you become one of the faces explaining why prices are rising again. That is why the contradiction is not a side note. It is the story. Maximum pressure meets maximum price control. Which one matters more? If you are looking at Tehran, the answer is pressure. If you are looking at a family budget in Pennsylvania, the answer is price. If you are sitting in Treasury before sunrise while someone across the table asks, "Can we hold this through the open?" the answer is uglier. You may not get to choose, because you can sanction vessels, coordinate with allies, signal calm, support waivers, help think through escorts and insurance backstops. But you cannot personally reopen a threatened waterway thousands of miles away, and yet the consequences can still hit American households by the weekend. That is what your line from April 2025 means when the pressure becomes real. Economic security and national security go hand in hand. In calm times, it sounds strategic. In crisis, it becomes literal. A tanker delay becomes a yield jump. A naval threat becomes a grocery bill. A shipping freeze becomes a change in the national mood. That is the lesson of Hormuz through your eyes. The global economy is so tightly wound that the second shock can matter as much as the first. The missile is the first shock. The price is the second. And your whole job, before markets open, is to stop that second shock from spreading faster than the first. Because if Hormuz stays disrupted long enough, the war does not stay over there. It shows up in gasoline. It shows up in airline tickets. It shows up in food. It shows up in yields. It shows up in the way millions of people feel when they look at the economy and think, maybe this is turning again. And then the question is no longer whether a foreign policy crisis can become a domestic economic crisis. The question is whether you can contain it before the country decides it already has.